Good day, everyone. My name is Rebecca Lilly for the International Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled The U.S. Battery Boom. We are grateful to our speaker, Michael Plante, for today's timely discussion. First, a little bit about the International Association for Energy Economics. We are the largest association specializing in the field of energy economics and provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, experience, and issues among professionals interested in the field. The organization produces 2 professional journals, a newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations, along with a host of other products and services you can find at our website at iaee.org. If you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our speaker. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot participate in today's live event. If you have questions for our speaker, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window and type your question. We've allocated time at the end of the webinar to read and answer them. And now I would like to introduce you to our speaker, Michael Plante, Senior Research Economist and Advisor. He has been the project manager of the Dallas Fed Energy Survey since its inception in 2016. Michael, over to you.
All right, thanks a lot. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining me. So, as Rebecca mentioned, I'll be talking about what I call the U.S. battery boom. So I'm Michael Plante, work at the Dallas Fed, and there we go. Since I'm at the Dallas Fed, but I'm here on my own behalf today, I have to read off this disclaimer. So anything I say today are my own opinions and do not necessarily reflect the official opinions of the Federal Reserve System or my bosses over here at the Dallas Fed. So with that said, let me give you a little introduction to where I'm coming from with this presentation, and then I'll give you a little intro onto where we're heading for the rest of the talk. So in case you don't know, there are 12 Federal Reserve banks, regional Federal Reserve banks here in the United States. Each of them typically has a research department that houses some PhD economists. And at the Dallas Fed, we have what I call a distinctive expertise in energy, which is just natural given that we're in Texas, which is a major energy producer in terms of oil, natural gas, and wind. And we just have a lot of energy companies here. So there's a critical mass of interest on energy subjects in this region. In our research department, we have a small group focused on energy. There are 3 PhD economists and 3 business economists. And when we do work like the one today where I'm presenting to the public or when I'm writing to the public, our goal is to strive to provide objective analysis on energy issues. As you can imagine, being from Texas, we have a traditional focus on oil and gas markets. But over the past year or 2, we've had a growing focus on some issues related to the energy transition. And that's where this presentation is coming from today. In particular, just in case anyone wants to see these later on, a lot of the presentation today is founded on some work I've done for our publications that are intended for public consumption. We have Dallas Fed Economics Series, which is a blog post, and Southwest Economy, which is a publication geared towards thinking about issues for the regional economy. So I've been working on this topic for about a year and a half now. So here's a list of some of the things I've written on, either solo or with some co-authors from the research assistants in the bank. And what am I going to talk about today specifically? So what I'll do is, this is going to be a high-level overview of how we got to the point where in the United States we could even imagine that there would be what I call a quote-unquote battery boom. And what I'm going to do is start out from the very beginning, give some highlights about what's going on with battery technology. And then I'll discuss what it means for EV performance and cost, because that's playing a role in this. And I'll give some information. Number 3 will be to give some information on automakers' EV plans and why that's leading to the battery boom that's happening now. And then at the end, I'll just close out by highlighting a couple of what I think are really interesting issues for the near-term outlook in this space. And before I get into the details, here are the key takeaways from this presentation in case you want to know them up front. So what I'm going to show you first is that lithium-ion batteries, which are used in EVs, they've had a lot of improvement in their performance over time, and their costs have fallen dramatically, particularly over the past decade. As a result, this is translated into rising ranges and lower costs for electric vehicles, although in many cases, these are still not quite on par with gasoline vehicles in terms of the upfront cost. But they're close enough so that automakers are interested in expanding production of them. And in fact, major automakers plan to spend billions on an EV build out. As a result, this is leading to a major build out in US battery capacity, which I've called the battery boom. And the outlook, for reasons I'll explain towards the end of the presentation, remains very interesting for a couple different reasons. So with that, let's get started into the details. So I'll tell you a little bit now about batteries. This is a super high level overview, so there's nothing too complicated here. It's just enough info to be interested in, get interested in the subject and to know why I'm going to talk about some of the stuff that I talk about later. So first, a basic overview. Just historically speaking, we've known about batteries for a long time. They've been around for more than 200 years, and they provide us power using chemical reactions. And the specific chemical reactions involved depend entirely on what the battery is made out of. There's actually many types that have been found in labs and so on, but commercially speaking, only a handful have had really great commercial success where everyone would know about them. In terms of the energy transition, where batteries come into play is rechargeable batteries. So they'll play a key role in the transition because they're the things that are going to provide the power for electric vehicles, and they're going to be used for storing electricity from renewable energy. Just some vocab here. So the individual batteries that we know and love, they technically get referred to as cells. They come in a variety of shapes, sizes, and chemistries. So the one that people on the webinars, as well as me, are most used to thinking about, for example, would be the AA or AAA batteries that you've seen. Those are an individual cell, typically of the alkaline chemistry. And in the EV market, though, it's a particular chemistry called lithium-ion batteries that dominate the market, and I'll show you in a couple of slides why that's the case. For an EV, they might be hundreds or thousands of these individual cells, and what they do with them is they don't just cram in 1,000 of these batteries by themselves. What will end up happening is they get packed into groups into what's called a module. And then there'll be a battery pack, which will house these modules as well as some other equipment that helps the batteries deal with battery management in terms of performance and safety features. So that battery pack will be the thing that houses all of the stuff and gets it running and keeps it running good. In case you were interested, this is purely for informational purposes. You wanted to see what some of these look like. So one type of the lithium-ion battery, they call it cylindrical format, but that's just the format we're used to seeing for the AA and AAAs. They come in set shapes and sizes, and you can see 3 of them here. And these are the kinds of batteries that Tesla uses. The one all the way on the right, that massive one, the 4680, that's the newest variant that Tesla is working on for their EVs here. And the lithium-ion batteries will come in some other shapes and sizes as well, but this is an example of what they look like. So what makes up the lithium-ion battery? Well, there are 4 different parts, generally, really high level, generally speaking, and these are 4 parts found in any battery cell that you use. It's just the components, what they're made of will differ. So one part will be the anode, and you can think of that as the negative charge of the battery. That's going to store the lithium when the battery is charged, and it's going to be the source of the electrons that will provide power when you're using the battery. For lithium-ion batteries, that's usually made of graphite, but there are some variations in that. There's a cathode, which you can think of as the positive part of the battery, the positive charge. That's going to store the lithium when the battery is empty, and there are several different types developed. And then there's the electrolyte, which is going to allow the lithium ions to move back and forth across to the anode and cathode. That's usually a liquid, and in the case of lithium-ion batteries, usually flammable. So it creates safety hazards for some classes of the battery. And then there's going to be a separator, which will keep the anode and the cathode from directly interacting because they have a different electric charge, so you don't want them to short out when you're running the battery. And then finally, just a little bit more vocab. So when it comes to batteries, and particularly for thinking about EV range, there's a lot of focus on the capacity of the battery. There are a couple of different ways of measuring this. The one that I like to use to talk about is watt hours and kilowatt hours. So that's just a particular measure of energy that you can use. You're most familiar, and me as well, I'm most familiar with thinking about this on my electric bill, because that'll usually be in units of kilowatt hours. So an individual lithium-ion cell might have capacity typically measured in watt hours, but an EV battery pack capacity will almost always be in kilowatt hours. Estimates of the average capacity across a bunch of different cars, that just varies depending on your source. Typically might be between 50 to 55 kilowatt hours, that's for the average, but it can be up to 100, it can even be much higher than that. So for example, here I listed the rated battery capacity of the Hummer EV, which is over 200 kilowatt hours. So you can get from the example that there won't be a one-to-one mapping between the capacity of the battery and the range. The Hummer needs a massive battery capacity like this because it is literally a massive vehicle relative to, for example, a Tesla. Excuse me. Now, batteries have lots of properties that people care about beyond just the capacity. One of them that gets a lot of focus in terms of thinking about EVs is energy density, which is just capacity per unit of mass or volume. And you can see why that would be of interest, because the more energy density you can get, the smaller the battery needs to be, and the greater the range, the greater the potential range of a car. Of course, cost also matters since you're buying these things. And there are many, many other features, such as the safety. Is it going to explode when I use it? How long does it take to charge it? How many times can I recharge it? What's its use going to be like in extreme weather, and so on and so forth. What I'm going to say here, just as an economist, what I've discovered is, not surprisingly, battery producers and EV makers, they're rational. So they are trying to maximize the performance of the batteries they produce at the least cost, where quote unquote performance, those metrics will often be defined by the application. Now, as an economist, though, I can also see immediately that there's an economic incentive to develop batteries that have higher energy density because they'll let you do more things. And in fact, over time, we've seen that with rechargeable batteries. So this here is a chart that I put together for one of the Dallas Fed Economics posts. It's making use of some publicly available data. It shows the ranges of energy densities that are out there for several different classes of rechargeable batteries. And they're ordered from left to right, roughly in terms of when these batteries were developed. You can see over time there's been a progression for having batteries with higher energy density, and you can see that the lithium-ion battery in general has significantly higher energy density than the other types that are out there. You can also see on the right-hand, all the way on the right-hand side though, that there are a class of batteries that I labeled under development or not mass-produced, and they potentially offer even higher energy densities than lithium-ion batteries. So that provides a signal in some sense that perhaps people aren't quite satisfied even with what the lithium-ion battery can offer. And there is a reason for this, which is that batteries in general, relative to liquid fuels, have very low energy densities in terms of volume or mass. You can see that in this chart here. Now in this chart, the liquid fuels that I'm showing here, they've not been adjusted for heat losses that would occur when you burn the fuels in an engine. And those losses can be significant, so they're a lot less efficient than using a battery. But even after you make those adjustments, diesel and gasoline are just on a mass or volume basis. They are much more efficient storage method for packing a lot of energy into a small amount of mass or space. So there's still pushes to develop better batteries. So what has all this meant for electric vehicles? Well, one thing that I want to point out, which didn't come across in the chart I showed earlier, which was a static image, is that lithium-ion batteries, they're evolving over time. So the first commercial use of the battery was in 1991. Since then, there have been several different chemistries of this variant developed, so usually new cathodes that allow the batteries to do different things or perform better. And over time, there's been changes to the existing chemistries to improve the performance. So one example that's been important over the past decade or so is there's a particular type of cathode, there are several of them that use nickel. And in those cases, they've tried to amp up the nickel content in order to replace cobalt, because cobalt is, one, relatively expensive, but two, it also has some ESG issues associated with it because of the mining practices in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We've also seen improvements in anodes where they've been adding silicon, and there's been a bunch of improvements in terms of what I just called product design and manufacturing improvements, including improvements to the modules and packs to make those more efficient at storing the batteries and improving the range and cost of the EVs. So this here is just, this comes from Bloomberg New Energy Finance. They've been sampling battery packs of different kind, lithium-ion battery packs of different chemistries. So each color there, not trying to overwhelm you with information, but each color there is a particular chemistry or formulation for the cathode of a lithium-ion battery. And what they've done is on the y-axis show you the energy density for the whole battery pack that they've sampled. And you can see over time that this has been rising since 2010. And the one there in the red dot, that's I'll call it a prototype battery. It's not exactly a prototype, but that's a new battery that a Chinese producer is releasing, which appears to have even better energy density than the ones that were sampled by Bloomberg. Now, what does that mean? Well, performance is increasing, but also all the other improvements that I've mentioned means that lithium-ion battery prices in terms of dollars per capacity have been declining significantly. So this chart is also sourced from Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Every year they do a survey where they literally go into the field and ask people who buy these batteries what they're paying for them. And then they release some information. This is the average across all the answers they get for this survey. You can see over time that the battery prices have fallen dramatically since 2013, both in terms of how much the pack is costing and how much the individual cells are costing as well. In one of the Dallas Fed economics posts I've put out there, I got a different data source. It's a very nice article, I believe, in Energy, and I'm going to get the journal name wrong now, but they went back all the way to 1991 when the first lithium-ion battery was installed, and then they had data through 2018, and prices there have declined more than 90% over that time frame. So prices have come down quite a bit. So you can imagine that EV makers are responding to this in various ways, and indeed the data shows that they have been. So this is a chart from a different Dallas Fed economics post that I wrote, which was looking at EV range and cost. This uses some data from fueleconomy.gov. And it's if you've never come across this data set, it's very nice. It provides information on MSRP, range, and a few other features for all vehicles approved for road use in the United States. So what me and my research assistant did here is we compiled these into several big groups, which included non-Tesla EVs and gasoline vehicles, and then Tesla EVs. And in this particular chart, what we're doing is looking at the median range across these broad categories. You can see that since 2012, excuse me, my allergies are acting up, excuse me. So you can see since 2012, there's been a dramatic increase in the range of non-Tesla electric vehicles. Back in 2012, the range was let's just be frank, very low, and you really would have had trouble driving that car around for a lot of different purposes. As of 2021, the typical non-Tesla EV has a range over 200 miles, which is more than sufficient for most daily trips that people are taking. Tesla range has also increased from an already high start, but in both cases, at least when looking at the typical vehicles, they still haven't quite caught up with the median gasoline vehicle in this data set. And not surprisingly, since the range is increasing, we know the battery costs are falling and other costs have been falling. The cost, at least measured as I did it in this blog post, which is MSRP per unit of range, has also fallen dramatically for non-Tesla EVs and for Tesla EVs as well. So you can see though, as of 2021, by this metric, still a little bit of a gap between the EV types and the gasoline vehicles in terms of the upfront cost, but it's a very dramatic improvement from where it was 10 years ago. Not surprisingly, consumers are responding to that, as well as to the incentives that are in place to get people interested in buying electric vehicles. So EV sales have been rising. I'm showing that here using some data provided by the International Energy Agency, where they're tracking registrations of electric vehicles across different groups of countries. And this here is just showing the battery-powered electric vehicles. You can see that sales have been rising not only in the United States, but particularly or more so in Europe and China, and particularly in China. Now, we don't have official data for 2022, but I've read estimates from various public sources that are out there, and EV sales continued to increase quite dramatically in the United States last year, as well as in these other groups. So the bar, once the official data comes out, the bar for 2022 is going to be well above the bar for 2021. So that kind of sets the stage for thinking about what's going on with the automakers and why there's this thing that I call the battery boom that's happening. So EVs, at least in my opinion, they are now getting good enough where the different classes of consumers are now thinking about buying them, even in the United States, where people are very cost conscious and range conscious about the car they want to purchase. There are more sales of these and there are more people interested in this. And automakers have decided to go in on this EV phase. So, and in some cases, they're going all in. In other cases, they're going not completely in. But you can see from the numbers I put up on here that the major automakers are expanding and spending lots of money. They're deciding to put a lot of money where their mouth is. So you get the big three up here. You can see these are in tens of billions of dollars. I got BMW here. Not all of that would be for US related EV production, but other companies are also involved in this. And these very large dollar amounts come with ambitious sales targets for EVs from these different companies. So at least in the United States, this is going to require lots of batteries. We just don't have the battery capacity to meet all of the targets that these companies have in place if they do meet them. So just some history though, just so you understand where we're at in terms of battery capacity. So for those who don't know, there was actually an initial wave of investment in lithium-ion battery factories following the Great Recession, because there was some money that was earmarked in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. Since then, though, there was modest capacity additions through 2020, and that's not, in my opinion, not surprising because EV sales really rose at just a modest pace since that over that entire decade. However, since the start of 2021, there's been a huge upswing in announced projects related to battery factories. And so I wrote one of these Dallas Fed Economics posts looking at this entirely, this whole issue here. And what we did is we went out and literally got the public announcements for all these different projects and tried to pin them down in terms of where they were, how much they would cost, what their capacity was, et cetera. So we've identified, since the start of 2021, we identified at least 25 greenfield or expansion projects. You'll see in the news, they often get referred to as gigafactories. That's a reference to their capacity. So the capacity of these factories gets measured in terms of the annual capacity of all the batteries they produce. And these factories are very massive, so their annual capacity will exceed 1 gigawatt hour of total battery capacity. In fact, many of these are much, much larger than that. They might have a rated capacity of 30 to 40 gigawatt hours per year if they were running at 100% capacity. The dollar values attached with these projects are very large because there's a lot of them, for one thing. Here, what I've done, this just shows you the time series. What I did is, in a given announcement year, we attach the dollar value that's associated with that, and this just tells you how much investment was announced in each year. You see this uptick in 2021, and then a massive amount of investment announced last year. Interestingly, most of this for 2022 was announced before the Inflation Reduction Act was passed. So suggesting that EV makers and battery companies have decided the economics warrant trying to set these plants up even before they knew the IRA was coming. And the IRA contains a number of provisions that make the economics of battery factories even better. Where are these guys located? So we've seen from the announcements that they will co-locate typically next to auto production facilities, and particularly EV production facilities. So this map shows you a dot for every location that we're able to find. And there's usually a battery company and an automaker, not always, but there's usually a battery company and automaker working together. You see that they cluster geographically, one cluster in the Southeast, one cluster in the Midwest, sort of around Detroit. Those are both major automaking centers. You can also see there's some facilities associated with Tesla EV production. And then there's a couple clustering down there in the Southwest in Arizona. All of these announcements are expected to dramatically expand US lithium-ion battery capacity. Now I here at the Dallas Fed, I'm not tracking all of this myself, but here I'm using some data from Benchmark Mineral Intelligence. They provided their estimates for 2021 capacity, as well as some forecasts for where they think things are heading in 2026 and 2031. If you take a look at that brown yellow bar, that's the United States. You can see they're forecasting substantial increases in US battery capacity through 2031. Importantly, though, you also note that they're forecasting a battery boom in other parts of the world, and in particular in China. So China already dominates large aspects of the lithium-ion battery supply chain, and at least according to the forecast from Benchmark Mineral Intelligence, when it comes to cell production, they're going to make very significant investments through 2031 that will dramatically increase their already large battery capacity. Now, for those of you who are very interested in understanding what this means for the regional economies that you might be living in, there are a bunch of other projects that have popped up, not necessarily related. They're not gigafactories themselves, but they're other parts of the battery supply chain. So I've identified 4 US projects which are related to lithium and cobalt refineries, one of them in Arizona, which is a proposed cobalt refinery, and then a couple lithium refineries, including one which should be constructed by Tesla down in South Texas. There have been announcements of battery materials plants. So those would be the factories that produce the anode and the cathode material. Some of them have been quite large. So I've documented more than $10 billion in spending in at least 4 sites. And of course, there's a bunch of EV manufacturing facilities and even some battery recycling projects that have started to pop up here in the United States. So we're witnessing the birth of what I call a new industrial infrastructure to deal with the production of batteries and EVs here in the United States. So this is kind of interesting. Now, what about the near-term outlook? So I just sort of summarized everything that's happened over the past 10 years and has taken us to this point where the companies are making all these announcements. So this area, this topic I'm discussing, touches upon a lot of different issues. So, and I don't know the answers to these near-term outlooks. I don't know how things will turn out. But I thought what I'd do is I would present a couple of key issues that I think are going to get a lot of conversation over the next couple of years. Some of them already are getting a lot of conversation. So one of them, and this is not just EV makers, but automakers in general and other parts of the economy, they have experienced cost pressure in terms of raw materials, but also in terms of supply chain issues. This is a tweet from Elon Musk. It's a year old, and some things have improved. But in other areas, they're still seeing issues related to these supply chain problems and cost increasing for raw materials. So I thought I'd use this here so you can get it from the man who does EVs himself. And last year, this led to a lot of price increases for electric vehicles. So a lot of the makers were forced to increase the prices of these. Now, by itself, that's not surprising. It's just economics. The cost of making the cars has gone up, so they've been forced to increase their price. The reason I think this is an interesting topic to watch is because really, particularly in the United States, where I think consumers are very cost conscious, really we need EV prices to be falling if we want to see what's going to be called mass adoption of EVs here. So that's just my take on this. So this is interesting to watch because this is pushing EV prices in the opposite direction. Now, some of this has gone away because it's exogenous to the automakers. Some of this, however, is endogenous because there is an ongoing EV boom, not just here in the US, but also in China and Europe, which is itself pushing up materials prices. One of the topics that I see more and more about is there's a healthy debate about the availability of some of the quote unquote critical minerals that are used either in the batteries or for the producing the electric vehicle. I've become most interested in lithium. So here's a chart. This is not my chart. So this is from a company called Albemarle. It's from one of their investor presentations. So Albemarle is one of the largest lithium companies in the world. And recently they've been nice enough, what they do is they talk about what they think the future holds in terms of lithium demand. So on the left portion of this panel, they're actually showing you their projections for global lithium demand. Now, I worked in oil and gas for a long time, and I know these really long-term forecasts are always difficult. They're probably going to be wrong if you're thinking about demand in 2030. And that's not the real reason. The real reason I'm showing this is because they've shown you the forecast over time from 2020 on. So you can see the forecast errors that they've made over the past couple of years. And in their forecast, what they've been doing is they've been increasing their expectations for global demand each year through the beginning of this year. And that's been happening because EV and battery demand has surprised to the upside. And so they're expecting demand to continue to grow dramatically for this chemical, for this element, excuse me. And there are questions about whether there will be enough lithium around in the near term to satisfy all the potential demand that's out there. And the reason there are questions about this is because lithium mines have very long startup costs, very long lead times, excuse me, often run into issues. So the supply curve is very, very steep in the short run for getting new lithium production online. So this will be talked about more, I think, in the next year or two. Now, I'd be remiss, of course, if I didn't mention to anyone who was out there that the US government has passed a lot of legislation which is attempting to build out the domestic supply chain of EVs and batteries. So this is just a very super high level summary of some of the stuff that's in there, but the key thrusts are in the Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act. And then there's a bunch of stuff in the Inflation Reduction Act. And so, for example, in the IRA, there are producer subsidies for making critical minerals and battery parts. The EV subsidies are tied to domestic content requirements, which is trying to get EV producers to think about sourcing things like lithium or refined lithium from domestic sources. And most importantly, in the IRA, there is a ban, if you want to qualify for the EV subsidies, there's a ban on the critical minerals and components in a battery that might be sourced from foreign entities of concern. And what that exactly means will depend on what the Treasury says it will mean, but in general, it's viewed as meaning China-based companies will be prohibited from, if you use something from a China-based company, you won't get the subsidy. And the reason that matters is because China currently dominates the EV battery supply chain at various points. They don't dominate the mining in many cases, but they dominate the processing and the producing of the materials and so on. So this is also a big push for trying to get activity reorientated domestically. And then where I'm going to close out is, of course, the whole thing has been about batteries improving over time. So I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention that there is lots of interest in developing better batteries. And this is also super interesting at this point in time. So it's at least most companies that I can tell of, they are aware that the current technology just doesn't meet the demand of all the consumers out there that want to buy these vehicles or want to use these batteries. So there are many, many, many companies exploring developing a better battery. In fact, you could have a whole presentation, I think, on this particular subject of who these companies are, what they're doing, where their funding's coming from. I've listed a couple of different avenues they're exploring. Some of them are closer to commercialization than others. Some of them are still very far away. They have major, based on the stuff they've done so far, major potential for improvement, but in many cases also major challenges for commercialization as well. Some of that is because they're trying to do new things that really haven't been done at a mass scale. And in other cases, because they're a little bit closer, but they've got to compete with lithium-ion batteries, which is getting a whole infrastructure set up right now. So that I'm just going to close out. These are the key takeaways I showed earlier. So what did I talk about today? Well, when you walk away, I hope what you'll take away is one, you can see that lithium-ion batteries, they're becoming cheaper over time. They're improving. This has led to EVs themselves becoming cheaper and better over time. And at this point in time, automakers are very interested in this EV issue. So they're planning to spend billions on an EV build out. And here in the United States, but also in Europe and also in China, this is leading to major buildups in US battery capacity. And the outlook, though, remains very interesting for several reasons I explained, but also for many other reasons that I didn't have time or expertise to go into. And so with that, I'm going to close out and let me stop sharing my screen and I'll try to answer some questions. We can have a discussion if anyone else wants to chime in as well. Okay. All right, so let me go. Okay, got some questions here. Start my video. Okay, thank you, Rebecca. I knew I was going to forget that. Excuse me. So, okay, let me see. Most of these are, okay. I'll just start from the top. So there's one at the very beginning. Hi, will you share these slides afterwards? Rebecca, are you guys sharing the slides or do I need to do that?
If you would send them to me, I will be happy to put them online.
Yep. Okay. So yes, I'm happy to share the slides. There's nothing confidential in them on our end. So these can be shared. So I'll send them to Rebecca, and you can reach out to Rebecca or me if you can't get a hold of her, and I'll give them to you. And then
Also,
Gloria asked a question.
Yeah,
Oh,
also
go ahead, Rebecca.
I'll be happy to post the video as well.
Okay, so that answers the second question. And then the third question was about the PowerPoint slides. So yes, you can get those. Just reach out to Rebecca and or me. And then there's a question, is the IRA one of the reasons that motivated Tesla to open a factory in Mexico? So actually, I have not been keeping a close eye on things in Mexico completely. They have a lot less activity as far as I'm aware of. But if Tesla is thinking about opening a factory in Mexico or has, then the IRA may be one of the reasons. So I'm not a lawyer, but I'm sure about this part. So the clauses in there that tie the EV subsidies to the domestic content, with the way they're phrased, is what will be counted as domestic content typically is something produced here in the United States and or in a country that we have a free trade agreement with. And so that opens the door to both Canada and Mexico, plus a handful of other countries. Okay. And in Germany, okay, second question from the same person, and in Germany. So in Germany, their stuff produced in Germany does not qualify, or my understanding is will not qualify for these kinds of subsidies unless I've misunderstood the kind of trade agreements we have in place with Germany itself. It'll all hinge on whether they have a particular agreement that is defined as a free trade agreement. My understanding is that's not correct. I mean, that would not hold. But as a lawyer might have a different opinion depending on what's out there. So in Germany, though, their focus there will most likely be their domestic sales in Europe. So these production facilities tend to co-locate next to demand centers. And so that'll probably be the real reason why they've decided to set up shop in Germany, because it's closer to Europe and cheaper to set up the facilities there and sell to Europe domestically there. Yes, let's see. Okay. Nice. Next question. Indonesia is the largest producer of nickel. Any ESG concerns on that side of the globe that you know of? What will be the impact on nickel production? Is any supply bottleneck expected due to increased demand for batteries? Any other thoughts on this? Okay, this is a great question. So I like to be upfront. So nickel is a topic that I have not spent as much time on relative to lithium. So I can't answer all of these questions. Although if you reach out to me, Bernardo, I may be able to put you in touch with some people who know a little bit more about this if you're really interested in learning about it. In terms of Indonesia, yes, there are two issues there. There are some ESG concerns about how that stuff might work out relative to what might be achieved by some companies operating, in Canada or North America or the United States. The other issue is Indonesia does not have a free trade agreement with the United States. And so if you're a company that is mined the nickel in Indonesia and then refined the nickel in Indonesia, when the subsidies get looked at in terms of the EV battery, that content, unless the Treasury does something that I'm not expecting them to do when they release the guidance, that particular content will not qualify for the critical minerals component of the subsidy. So there may be some issues there in terms of, well, how will EV makers or battery makers deal with that? And likely some of them will try to find sources here in North America. And I know there's one company, I'm going to get the exact name wrong, I think Talon Metals. They have a mine or a proposed mine, nickel mine in the United States. And I know Tesla is interested in that. And it's probably for the subsidies. But that's what to my extent of knowledge that I can answer that question, but reach out and if I can try to find someone else who can help you out if you want some more details. Okay, next question. How low do you expect EV prices will need to drop to kickstart mass adoption? What kinds of infrastructure enhancements would we need to kickstart this? So to answer this question, since this is Chris, I will first make sure I refer back to my disclaimer that anything I say are my own opinions. And then my own opinion on this is, in the United States, at least, I don't think this is true in other parts, necessarily true in other parts of the world, but in the United States, I think actually that EV prices will need, well, post-subsidy, maybe they can they'll be lower, but they need to be very close to what gasoline cars are selling for. And in fact, they maybe even would need to be holding everything fixed a little bit cheaper, because consumers here, for reasons that may or may not be rational, they have range anxiety and they're concerned about charging infrastructure. So that's my view, that here in the United States, people really want to get a car that is pretty close in terms of performance and cost to what they're driving now. If they get that, then I actually think once people drive an EV and they get used to it, if the charging infrastructure is around, I expect most consumers won't care very much about what they're driving. But that's just my take on how I think that'll play out. And regarding the infrastructure and enhancements, we've never done a study about how much you would need per square mile. But this is going to be important. It's recently come up in the past couple of weeks in the media, some articles percolating about non-Tesla owners. They've bought these EVs and now they're trying to drive around in places outside their home, and they have questions or concerns about the charging infrastructure in place. So it's a signal, I think, that's my reading, is a signal that we're going to need some of these enhancements or additional enhancements for people to feel comfortable driving them the way they would drive a regular car. But again, that's my take on this stuff. And there's a great question: when do you expect EV adoption to surpass 50, 75, and 100% in the US? And the answer is, Jack, I'm just going to give you the honest answer. I do not know. It's still relatively low here. So we'll see. I mean, 50% is a pretty high bar, but not anytime in the next couple of years is my answer. And then I think I'm going to leave it at that. Unfortunately, I just don't have an answer for that one. Excuse me. Let's see. Oh, lots of questions coming in. Okay. Next one. Amar, do you think the supply chain issue will be resolved soon? If not, how could countries meet their targets in the adoption of zero emission, non-EV vehicles? Yeah, so this gets into some issues related to chips and automakers, which I don't know the outlook enough to confidently answer your question, Amar, in terms of that side, because I know that's playing a role. I will say the US target, well, the US doesn't have a target. The Biden administration has a goal for EV sales. That's pretty far out though, in 2030. So one would hope as an economist, I'll give a vague economist answer to that. One would hope as an economist that the supply chain issues themselves might, if they involve chips and things like that, might work themselves out by then. Questions about material availability, that will be different. But the answer is for that involves, in the future, and no one really knows how that's going to play out. That's kind of like thinking about the oil and gas market. We all have an idea of how things will play out 2-3 years out, but then we get 2-3 years out and stuff has happened that we weren't expecting. So, but so we'll have to see how that all plays out. Okay, Chris has a question. Given EV battery production will need to compete with grid battery storage, who wins? I don't know. So again, just like to be upfront, have not done economic analysis about that. However, I have looked at a bunch of the different forecasts, and on this particular topic, based on what I've said, EV battery production is going to win, at least in the near future. The demands, the growing demand on that side is much larger. And my understanding is, at least for now, in terms of using batteries to store electricity, it's still fairly expensive. And therefore the demand on that side is a little limited. So most of the forecasts I've seen show stationary storage growing over time, but it's much more muted relative to EVs, which is going to be the main source of demand. And then there's a great electricity question, which I'm not going to be able to answer. I'll read this, but this is out of my gearbox. Do you think distribution networks will be able to accommodate all the EV loads? If not, what should be done? So I'm going to pass on this question, Rebecca, and I don't know how to say the person's name. Oytun maybe might be the name. Sorry, I can't answer your question just because I'm not an electricity person, so I don't know the full answer to that. So I'm going to skip that. Okay. Let's see. Okay, great question from Kenneth. The increased use of intermittent power sources, wind and solar, will require massive use of stationary storage, which currently also uses the same materials as EV batteries. Oil and gas inventories are often measured in days of use. Doing so for utilities would require maybe hundreds of terawatt hours of batteries, not the gigawatt hours. Can both uses be reasonably produced given the material limitations in this century? So Kenneth, sorry. My view would be depends on what your time frame is. If you're looking at, if we're thinking about a century, then my understanding is for most of these minerals, well, given a century, I'm sure they can find new sources. They might not cost as much, they might not be as cheap as what they are now, but they're out there. Looking much more near term though, these will be competing. And as I just mentioned in a previous question, all the forecasts I've seen suggest the real boom in demand is going to be coming from EVs, and they've already been pushing up the cost. And as I mentioned, generally batteries appear to be a relatively, say, costly way of storing and producing electricity. So I think the EV batteries are going to win on that side in the near-term future. Now, interestingly, though, I didn't get into this subject at all because I didn't get into stationary storage, but there's a bunch of companies, they're aware of what you said, that the batteries currently in use the same materials as EV batteries. So there are a bunch of companies trying to develop new batteries that don't use lithium, that aren't lithium based, but can be used for stationary storage. And in fact, at least in theory, a couple of them have better properties for that. They can be used for longer duration storage. And if that's something you're interested in, feel free to reach out. And then what I can do is send you a couple of the company links out there about what these guys are working on. So their companies are also responding by trying to sidestep this whole issue about the availability of the materials. And, okay, next question I can answer. Okay, this is in my wheelbox. Have you seen or do you anticipate oil extraction companies diversifying / pivoting to critical mineral extraction for EV materials? The answer is, as far as I know, for all the oil companies that I look at, the answer is no. They have not made any real attempt to get into that market. Some of the very largest have made attempts to get into other parts of the area that you might consider energy transition related. So, you know, BP and Shell, for example, I know BP has gotten involved, I believe, in renewable energy. And I believe it was BP has also bought some kind of charging station company. So they're thinking in the services, but in terms of getting into critical mineral extraction, I've not seen any examples yet. And was recently talking to someone about this, and it sounds like the expertise needed to do both well doesn't completely fit in terms of the skill set you need. So we'll see if that happens. The large oil companies certainly have the money to get involved in terms of doing some of this stuff, but so far they have not. And I think that's a reflection of the skill sets being different. So lots of questions. Hey, Rebecca, so what do we go to, 10?
It's up to you. Yes, and
Okay.
then if you also have extra questions you would just like, I can export them and send them to you after the webinar.
Okay, let me see. Yeah, we might need to export them, but let me try to get through what I've got here. Some of them I don't think I can answer. Let me try this. So let's see. Okay, next question. Oh, okay, so another question. This is interesting. I'm tuned from Germany. Here, there was an initiative to have only EVs in the streets. What are your thoughts on regards to that? Do you think we will achieve a discard we will achieve to get rid of petroleum-based transportation? So, yeah, so again, I'll go back to the disclaimer just so everyone knows these are my own opinions. So this initiative for having only EVs on the streets, I see several, at least in the near-term future, as an economist, I see several potential hookups there that could be negatives. One is the question about whether people can afford to buy electric vehicles. So you could have a ban on, there are several places that are trying to have bans on sales of gasoline vehicles. So as an economist, immediate question rises up, okay, well, that could be a binding constraint. That could be a constraint that affects people's behavior, or maybe not. The question will hinge on the cost of the EVs, for example. So at least currently where we are, such a prohibition, I think, would be a constraint on people's behavior. I mean, if people wanted to, at least in the US, if people wanted to just buy an EV, they would go try to buy an EV, but we've seen that so far they're not entirely convinced about that. So this, I think, is going to change people's behavior, but I think what it'll do is create avenues for getting around this in ways that aren't completely being thought of. For example, in terms of the sales, you might imagine that what this will do is affect the used car market in ways that are unexpected. You know, for example, leading to more used cars being purchased or used on roads that are petrol-based, that are gasoline-based. Outright bans of gasoline vehicles on the streets, maybe in Europe, if people are really interested. I can't comment on Europe. I'm not from Europe. In the United States, I just, as someone who's born here and raised, I just don't see such a policy of that nature ever gaining, not gaining traction anytime in the near future. People just require the use of petrol-based, gasoline-based transportation for everything they do in their daily life. And the infrastructure is just not set up to deal with this. And they just are not, the EVs are just not cheap enough to satisfy the demand that would be needed to replace all the gasoline vehicles. So we sell, like, you know, say 13, 15 million cars, light duty vehicles a year. EVs are not even close to that. There's not even enough production, so that wouldn't work here. So anyways, long rambling answer to some of these questions, which I think are super interesting. But that's how I think about that stuff so far over here in the United States. And feel free to follow on, Gloria, if I didn't quite answer everything you were asking about. Okay, let's see. Do you think hybrid cars will exist in the future, or are they just a transitional vehicle to be replaced by pure EVs? Great question. I'm gonna skip that though. I've never actually owned a hybrid or an EV. I am a little surprised just on what I know about the performance of hybrids and EVs. I'm a little surprised that hybrids haven't had more success, because they are kind of, in a certain sense, might be a transition between the two, but in other senses they're not. Well, you know, I'm gonna skip that one for now. Wait, Tim, sorry. Next question, asking about whether I own an EV. So do you own, drive an EV? If not, why not? Just asking for personal opinion on this from a consumer's perspective. So that answer is no, I don't have an EV. If not, why not? Several reasons. One, because I am a little cheap and I have a car that I've owned for a while that I paid off and just don't want to have a new car bill. The second reason is they are a little expensive in my view for the upfront cost, and I don't drive too much. So the cost savings in terms of the OpEx, this is just an economic decision. The cost savings in terms of the OpEx would not be very great for me. So I just haven't been convinced enough to buy one yet. But when I go look for a new car, I'll probably take a look at the options, which would be different from what it would have been, what I would have done 10 years ago. For those more generally who want to think about why or why not people are buying EVs, in case this is of interest, I would recommend going on Google and searching around for this. People who are really interested in autos, there are a bunch of sites where people will go and share their experiences. In fact, in some cases, they'll give you detailed information about what it was like when they were driving or when they purchased an EV, what kind of performance you can expect. So there's a lot of information about this online that is very useful for people. So that might be something worth looking into. Okay, question. How would you explain the falling cost, the dropping cost over the last 10 years? Is it weakly or strongly related to R&D and innovation processes? So my understanding is if we're talking about battery cost, it is strongly related to R&D, although we have to be a little bit careful about what we mean by R&D. So it is both in terms of them finding better ways to make the batteries that they're producing, but also changing the chemistries, which reduces which raises the energy densities, but also getting their innovation in terms of how they manufacture these things. And that stuff I don't completely understand. But there's been just a bunch of research on all margins to try to make it easier to produce these batteries to give them greater energy density. And all of these things are playing a role in making the costs fall over time. Now, you might argue, of course, some of that is just economies of scale, and that's correct. But I think while the economies of scale are getting bigger too, they're figuring out better ways to do stuff, learning by doing while they're making the batteries. Let's see, there was a question. Let's see, next question. How can we reach to your articles regarding EVs? So if you get the slide, there are two ways. If you have the slides, they should have the link in there for the 4 different publications I've done. And then if you can't get those, you can just send me an email and I can send you the links and you can take a look. And also I'm happy, I'm also happy to provide references if anyone out there is interested in a particular topic. If I know some better source of information, I'm also happy to provide references if anyone reaches out. Okay. Is that it?
I believe that's it.
Yeah. Oh, wait. No, I missed one.
Oh.
One last question. Let's see. Hopefully he's still on air. Khalid. So Toyota announced they will divide their investment on electric mobility between battery-powered electric vehicles and fuel cell. I think it's fuel cell vehicles, giving the challenges of supply chain and raw materials, et cetera. How can battery-powered EVs compete with other technologies without any policy push? Do you think we need to wait for a solid-state technology breakthrough? Okay, great question. So this is getting on a couple issues, but let me discuss the solid-state question. So there's a class of batteries that are being developed called solid-state batteries in the lithium-ion space. What they do, very generally speaking, is they replace the electrolyte. Instead of being a liquid or polymer, it's based on a solid. And there are several reasons why, in theory, that will improve the performance of the battery. And in fact, in some cases, at least in the lab, improves the performance of the battery dramatically in terms of the energy density, but also in terms of the safety and also in terms of charge time. Unfortunately, no one's been able to commercialize that yet. So Khalid, you want the answer about how the battery-powered electric vehicles could compete with other technologies without a policy push is, to a certain extent, they're already competing without the policy push, at least here in the US, on a very small portion of the car market. So companies have figured out that consumers are really interested in these high-cost, high-performance cars, like Porsches and Teslas. And for a while, Tesla had no access to the subsidy, and people were still buying because they had gone over the cap, and people were still buying Teslas. So for that particular part of the market, they seem to have found a recipe that works. Now that's a small part of the market. But yeah, in terms of getting cheaper cars that more people want to buy, solid state batteries are pretty far away. So, I think what they need to do is, and they may or may not be able to do this, no one knows, they need to find ways of reducing costs or improving performance on the margin for the current batteries that are out there somehow, or finding better ways of manufacturing the car through economies of scale that can push the costs down so that they can get into bigger markets. But that's just my take on that. And so on that, I'll wrap that up right there. Excuse me. All right, Rebecca, I think that's it. I hope I answered everyone's questions satisfactorily, but I'm happy to try to chat later if people are still interested. Just let me know.
IAEE wishes to thank Michael Plante for an outstanding webinar. This webinar will be available on IAEE's website for future download. If you're not a member of IAEE, we will encourage you to join by visiting www.iaee.org. We thank you for attending, and I officially close this webinar.